How's it going, YouTube? Today we're going to be doing some cylinder head assembly. We just got the short block done. Got the pistons installed, CP pistons, skunk 2 rods, king bearings, all that stuff. I went through everything in the last video. If you haven't seen that, be sure to go check it out. But yeah, so I got my valve spring tool here. You need a special tool to do the B series cylinder heads. This just has like a cup here with a thing. It's just like a C-clamp, but it has an extended thing to go onto the valve. So now I am just cleaning the cylinder head up. I soaked it with oven cleaner, and it's looking pretty decent. I still got to drain a lot of the brake cleaner and the oil out of it, but just draining a lot of the old oil out, making sure she's clean. But yeah, we're going to get to prepping this thing and show you what I do on the cylinder heads. I also got the transmission over here soaking in oven cleaner so I can get that cleaned up and it's not an eyesore in the engine bay. Alright, so I got the cylinder head here on the bench. I just did one of the valve springs and retainers. I pulled the old one out and I put the new one in. These are the valve springs we're going to be using. These are the Skunk 2 Alpha Series dual valve springs and titanium retainers, as you can see here. These are really nice parts. I kind of like Junk 2. I call them Junk 2 because back in the day, Skunk 2 used to be kind of shady, but they changed their game around. So good for them. They make some really good parts now. Anyways, so these heads are a little bit tricky. Single cams are a lot easier than dual cam motors like an H series or a B series or whatever. You can do this two different ways. You can pull out the rocker assembly. There's like two hex screws. There's one on this side and then one on the opposite side. You just take those out, it's a Torx bit, and then all the rocker arms will come out. There's a big shaft that runs through the head here for all the rocker arms. You don't necessarily need to do it. You can just kind of push the rocker arms up as you pull the valve springs out. Like I said, this is the tool I'm going to be using. My buddy actually let me borrow it because I don't have one of my own. I need to get one. But yeah, so just got to get this, just like any other valve spring tool, got to get it underneath the valve and then tighten this thing up onto the valve. Alright, so this is how the tool looks when it's set up. This has like an open area here so you can get the valve keepers out of the valve, and then on the bottom here there's a bolt that's on the other end that holds the valve up. So when we tighten this, it's going to push just the valve spring, and it's going to give us access to the keepers. So I'll just take my magnet, it's a magnetic screwdriver, and we'll get the keepers out, just like that. We loosen it back up. And there we are. Now they are out. This motor did have dual valve springs installed already, as you can see here. I don't know what retainers these are. They look like they're aftermarket, but I'm not sure exactly what. They look like a steel retainer. If any of you guys know what retainer this is, I'd like to know. But like I said, it's got blocks, dual valve springs in it currently. They're kind of like a cheap valve spring, but they do work. And like I said, I don't know what retainer this is. It could be stock, but usually when you have an aftermarket retainer, you go with a titanium, and they are a very shiny metal. Now that the spring is out, we can actually push the valve out of the cylinder head as well. And we can inspect our valves. Now normally you could put some valve lapping compound on these and clean them up. This head looks like it was recently done. not too long ago, so I'm just going to put them back in with the new valve springs and retainers. That's really the important part here, but this head actually has flat valves on it, and flat valves actually will increase your compression ratio. Normally these valves have like a dish in the center, and these are an aftermarket flat valve, which, like I said, if you don't have, this just closes more space in the combustion chamber, which in turn gives you more compression and more horsepower. Alright, so I'm going to try to do this as best as I frickin' can on camera. These Skunk 2 valve springs and retainers, I don't think it matters what direction they go. You just got to kind of, I usually pick the side that the retainer fits on the best, and this side seems like it's pretty good. So this just goes, on like that. The retainer goes on top of the valve spring, just like this. And a good tip here is to just put the retainers, or the keepers, into the retainer before you put it into the cylinder head. So the retainers are now sitting, I keep fucking mixing up retainer and keeper, but the keepers are sitting in the retainer now, just like this, and this just makes it easier, so you don't have to like line the keepers up with the valve when you have everything compressed and under tension. This just makes it a lot easier. So we'll slide the valve spring and retainer in, and then we'll put our tool back on, and then you kind of just got to line up the valve with the opening on the retainer and make sure your keepers don't back out. So I just take a screwdriver and I push the retainer, or the keepers, back in to the retainer here, and then just keep throttling down with the tool here, pushing the retainer, or pushing the keeper as you go here, and one of them fucking popped out. This is just what happens when you do this. This is kind of a really tedious process on a B series head. So we gotta take it back out. Like I said, this is a very tedious process. You gotta make sure that the keepers do not fall out of the retainer as you install everything. One trick here that works pretty good is when you're tightening down on the valve spring, just hold your finger above the retainer here and keep pressure on the keepers. So that way that they'll kind of just fall into where they need to go into the valve slot. But this is the situation that you want it to look like as you're compressing it down. So I'm going to continue to compress this down quick for you guys and try to film it as best as I can. It's kind of a bitch doing this with a GoPro, and the GoPro really sucks with like close stuff, you know what I'm saying? Like if you really want to get like detailed, it's kind of hard for you guys to see, but I'm just compressing it down. Now I'm going to push the retainer down a little bit more with my finger. Sometimes wiggling the valve spring tool a little bit back and forth helps get the keeper set into the slot. And now they are in. You just need to get them down past the slot on the valve where they sit. So now that they're like in their little spot, we can just back it out. Like I said, this is a bitch. Alright, now we're just going to back it out. And as you can see, it's installed. And that's what you're going to want it to look like when you're done. And I always take like a back end of a plastic screwdriver here and just give it a couple bumps. That way you know that the keepers are in good and it's seated properly. And this one seems good. Maybe I'll do another one for you guys and kind of try to get a better camera setup here that shows you a little better. Figure I'd give you guys a quick look at the engine bay while it's nice outside and maybe a little bit better lighting. Some of this wiring out of the way. Alright, I got the transmission cleaned off too here. Just using that oven cleaner. Got all that grease and dirt off. That stuff works miracles. So my girlfriend volunteered to help me out here with helping me film these valve springs. And hopefully you guys can see it a little better. And she can help me film. And I don't have to like hold the cylinder head and the C-clamp and the flashlight and all that at once.
Voluntold.
Voluntold. Okay, you have to come over here and like you want to hold this too? I know this is a lot of work. Alright, so just take my magnet here, magnet screwdriver thing, pull the keepers out. Now you can just take a socket and a hammer and pound on the retainer, and usually the keepers and everything will fall out. But if you do it that way, you risk, having the keepers fall into the cylinder head, and then you got to look for them, and it's just a pain in the ass. And this kind of helps you guys see what's going on too. I'll use the hammer and socket technique on like a junkyard head or something, but not this. As you can see there, those are the valve seals where the valve goes through. Those look all great. I've been checking them as I go here, and they look good, so we're not going to replace them. Grab another valve spring and retainer. Okay, so the retainer here, like I said, just goes on top of the valve spring like this, and just make sure it's nice and flat here. Sometimes on these dual valve springs you got to give them a push, and then they sit into the outer spring. There you go. See, like I said, just got to give them a little push sometimes, get them to seat down in there, and then we'll install the keepers into the retainer here, and notice how one side of the keeper here is bigger and one side of the keeper is smaller. It's tapered so it locks into the valve. Now we're going to pop the retainer in there, and on the other side, just like that, and then we'll put it into the cylinder head. I think we're lined up, and we just gotta compress it down. Now as we walk the tool down, these keepers are gonna want to back out, so you can either like hold them down with a screwdriver or your finger. I usually just push them down as I walk the tool down a little bit, so just keep pushing on those. Now right about here they can pop out, and this is, you gotta get them perfect. Sometimes they work every time, sometimes they fly out every frickin' time. But we're gonna try to do our best here. See, okay, this bottom one just sunk in, and now we just gotta get this top one here. I'm gonna do it with a screwdriver so you can see what's going on. But we're just gonna push this keeper down in just like that, and then you just release or back off the valve spring tool, and voila. It's hilarious. I literally just sat here for like 10 minutes working on one of these because the keepers kept popping out. Like I said, sometimes if you don't have everything lined up like perfectly and the keepers are not, centered onto the valve stem, they're gonna keep popping off and it's gonna piss you off. But what do we got left? I got like 6 left to do. I got the whole exhaust side done and 2 on the intake, so I just got to do 6 more on the intake and this thing will be all set. Now I'm actually cleaning off the intake manifold gasket surface here. This is a huge problem on Hondas. Like when guys switch intake manifolds, I feel like they're just too lazy to clean off the surface here, and then you put the gasket over like another old gasket and you get a vacuum leak. And it always comes down to the famous Honda idle surge. The wombo. Because, the idle motor doesn't know what to do when you have a vacuum leak. Now, when you clean this surface, all that is pretty much eliminated. You won't ever have a vacuum leak at the surface here, and, the car should run a lot better. Like I said, this is a very kind of important step that I think that is important, at least, just because I hate when my cars idle like shit and they don't run right. So yeah, we're just getting this surface cleaned off. It just sucks because like This gasket is so caked on here, you literally can't peel it off. That was the only spot that peeled off. I've been trying to pick away at it, but yeah, this gasket is caked onto this cylinder head here. I don't know if you can see here. I cleaned this portion already, you know, this side of the head. This is all just like dust from the gasket. And then this guy here too. I'm obviously going to clean all this shit out, but just showing you here. Just using a wire brush on the end of the drill here and just kind of going to town until the gasket is gone and comes down to bare metal like this. That's what we're looking for. Alright, we got the head surface cleaned up here. You can see that turned out pretty nice where the gasket sits. This is what you want it to look like. And then same goes for the intake manifold. I got this side sort of cleaned up, and then I still got to work on this side here. You can see a lot of the old gaskets still stuck onto the manifold here. Got to get all that off. There we go. Intake manifold's all clean. The surface here and the surface here. Now I am just installing the head studs into the motor and lubing them up with the ARP lube. This is like torque lube or something, so supposedly you get a better torque reading using this stuff. I've never noticed a damn difference, but we're going to put her in. So on these head studs, I usually just get them started and then run them all the way down. They actually have like an Allen head on the top of the stud, and you just take an Allen wrench and run them down until they stop. Give them a little tug, and then you can throw your head gasket on and throw the head on. Get a good hard look at those pistons, because you're not going to see them anymore after we put the head on. Got all the head studs tightened down here. Now I'm just cleaning the surface and making sure that our head gasket has a good mating surface to seal to, and there's no like junk on the surface of the head. So now we're going to throw our gasket on. Alright, so we just got the head gasket on. Notice how on the head gasket it says up. If you do not have this facing up and you install it backwards, the head gasket's going to leak oil like freaking crazy. Right, now we're just lining up the cylinder head with the studs. She pops right on. You got to make sure that it sits down into the dowel pin though. There we go. It's seated into the dowel pins. Sometimes the dowels are a little bit tight and the head doesn't like to sit down right away. But just give it a little push and she's good. So now I'm going to get the head studs in, or the head nuts, and we'll torque this cylinder head down. So first we're going to put the washer onto the stud. And these are a little bit tricky, but this is a little trick that I do, and it works great, is just take the Allen wrench that you use to tighten the stud into the block and put the washer on the Allen wrench, and then put the Allen wrench into the stud and then drop the washer down onto it using the Allen wrench to kind of knock it in place. These studs are kind of a pain, but they're not that bad. Now we gotta lube the ARP nuts before we put them on. A little trick on these too is when you put the ARP assembly lube on the inside of the nut here, you can also put some around the threads so it actually sticks into the socket. That way you can kind of position it into the stud and it won't be falling off and dancing around inside the head a bunch. So like I said, I just put a little bit on the nut, and that way the stud doesn't, or the nut doesn't fall out of the socket. Sorry, I just noticed my camera's like over here. Sorry about that. I'll fix you there. Much better. Alright, next I'm throwing the water pump on. This sucker only goes on one way. I always put some RTV around where the old seal was. Seems to work every time. I don't have any problems like that. So we'll get this thing bolted up. 5 bolts hold the water pump to the motor. Crank them suckers down to about tight foot-pounds. Right about right there. What about this one? That one might be a and a half. I forgot some of these water pump bolts are actually longer than others. So you got to make sure that you don't put like a long one in a short hole or like a short one in a long hole. I noticed that this bottom left bolt is a shorter bolt. So you got to make sure you don't mix those up. And then go in a quarter, in a half, in a quarter. Yeah. Yeah. Fucking mint. Hopefully you can see this. This is the timing belt tensioner. It's got a spring with two hooks on it. And then this little like spring cover. One of the hooks hooks into the small hole on the tensioner. There's like two holes. One hole on one side that's bigger, and then the smaller hole over on the other side. Hook the spring into the smaller hole, and then there's a like a little tab here that the spring hooks on there. And then the other big hole, there's like a stud that comes out of the block. That's where that one goes. And then your bolt slides in here like so. There we go. The water pump and tensioner are on. Now we got to assemble the rest of the head here to get the timing belt on. So I'm going to throw the crank gear on now. And there's going to be two of these like bigger washers. And you're going to want to put one of the washers on the inside of the crank gear right here. And then you're going to want to put the crank gear on like so. And then the other timing belt washer goes on the other side of it. We're going to wait until we get this thing timed before we put this back on. And then after this, we'll go the crank pulley. Okay, so you want to do this step before you put the cams in. Just because you can rotate the motor as much as you want without the cams installed. But once the cams are installed, there's actually going to be some of the valves open, and if you turn this around, you could actually hit the piston on the valve. So this is an important thing to do before you put the camshafts in. Now, there's a mark on the crank gear right here. It's just a line, and then there's a line, or like an arrow, on the oil pump right here by my finger. And you got to line those two up, and that means we are at top dead center. So now we can put the camshafts in, knowing that the motor is at top dead center. Got the caps on now to the cylinder head, and notice how they're like marked. Like this one's number 4, this one's number 3, this one's number 2, that one's 1, that one's 1, and then these ones are 5. Now remember, goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the arrows all point towards the timing belt. So now we got all the caps on. We can put our rails on. These are like the VTEC rails or whatever. And then we'll torque all these down. Remember on the third cam cap here, underneath it, there is actually like a seal, like an O-ring, and a dowel pin. And you got to make sure that that seal is in there. Otherwise your VTEC may not work. The head caps and the rails and everything are tightened down. We're going to make sure that the cams are lined up here. You want to make sure that the dots, or the arrows I should say, are like level with the cylinder head surface here. There we go. Those two marks are lined up now. And you got to make sure that the arrows are pointing up, or the up symbols on the cam gears are facing up, just like this. That means we are lined up. Now we will throw the belt on. So we're going to start with the belt down here and walk it over the tensioner like so, and then around the water pump, and then over the cam. The belt on now. Like I said, make sure that mark is lined up with the mark on the pump. And then your timing belt just runs around the tensioner there, and then around the water pump, and then you'll have to go onto the cam gears. Now, when you offset the cam gears like this with the one arrow on the left side facing like the middle of this slot right here, you can see, this actually helps make everything line up a little better. And then once you spin the motor over, everything will be lined up. Make sure the belt's on all the way. And then we'll take the slack out of the belt here by cranking up on this one, this gear here. There we go. And see, when I tighten on this one, this makes the marks line back up again, if that makes sense. I'm trying to make sense out of this, but it's kind of hard to explain. This thing is timed, everything looks good. The belt is very tight, which is what I like to run them at. You know, you can still move it, but it does have a lot of tension to it. That way it won't jump a tooth at high RPM or anything like that. So, I don't know if you've seen in the last clip, but I took the pry bar underneath the tensioner like this, and then tightened the tensioner to get the belt tighter. Now, when you get everything set like this, it's always a good idea to spin the motor over a few times and then double check everything, which I did do, and this thing is rock solid, looks dead on. So it is timed. All right, we just got the timing cover on and the motor mount, as well as the crank pulley and the bolt and everything like that. So now this thing is pretty much ready for all the stuff on the back. So we'll do that next. So now I had to take the water pipe off of the other block that we had and install it into here. The problem is when you pull these water pipes off, a lot of the times the O-rings on the outsides are stretched pretty bad. The inside one's not bad, but the one out by the thermostat housing is kind of bad. So we're gonna get this one in first. Just make sure if you're reusing the seals to put a bunch of marine grease on the seal. It definitely helps get it to slide in a little better. And make sure that the seal doesn't push out at all. There we go, just like that. If the seal pushes out, obviously it's gonna leak coolant everywhere. So yeah, get this sucker in. And we gotta get the thermostat side on now. Okay, so I got the water pipe on and the seals are good. So I went to go swap over the oil cooler because GSR motors normally run an oil cooler that bolts right onto the oil filter housing here, and then has a coolant line running into the water pipe here, and one of them is a heater hose, I believe. So yeah, this block actually cannot accommodate for an oil cooler because it has this fitting here for the oil filter, where on a other GSR block has this is not here, and it's just a threaded hole where you can put this on with the stud. This stud would normally thread in and bolt this oil cooler on, but yeah, can't run that on there. So, and then there's also like a plug right here. It's like a 14 millimeter bolt that just goes right here. And on the other GSR motors, they have a fitting that comes out of here for coolant. So another end of the oil cooler goes into that fitting. So yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to run the oil cooler on this, which is not a big deal. But yeah, so now we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do with these water pipe fittings here. We're either going to have to cap them off somehow or something. So yeah, that's what I'm working on now. Next thing I did here is I put the black box on the back of the motor here. This is like for evap or some shit. Normally it runs through the intake and then connects into, you know, the whole PCV system. But since we're turbocharged, I usually just dump this like towards the ground and leave it open, and then the line comes into the motor here. What else we got here? The alternator brackets I got on. Super self-explanatory. And now I pulled out the oil pressure sensor, which is right here on the back of the motor. It's 15/16 socket. Takes that sucker out, and this was what was on the other motor. It's just a T fitting here, and it's got the oil pressure sensor on one side, it's capped on another, and then the turbo feed line comes out of this side. So we're going to get this installed into where the oil pressure sensor was, so we can have turbo oil. I just checked the valve lash on the motor. just to make sure everything is good. And this thing is like spot on. You're going to want 7 thousandths on the intake and 9 thousandths on the exhaust. I usually just stick it here under the cam, drag it through, and this thing has like perfect amount of resistance. So valve lash is good. Now I'm ready to throw the intake manifold on. I went to the store and got a gasket. So I got that sucker on there. And we're about to pop the intake on. And then I also kind of just plugged off this coolant pipe fitting that we're not going to be using because we don't have the oil cooler. It's kind of ghetto, but I don't think it's going to work. Or I don't think it's not. I think it'll work. I don't think it's going to leak is what I meant to say. And honestly, it wouldn't be a Honda without at least something ghetto. So that is going to wrap it up for this video. I gotta end it now because my camera's going to be dying. And yeah, so this thing's looking awesome. I got everything done. I just have to put the harness back on. And yeah, I gotta rewire some stuff on the harness because there was a bunch of plugs that were cut and just had butt connectors on them. So I'm definitely gonna have to clean some of the wiring up and whatnot. Then I got to stuff the clutch and flywheel back on, throw the trans on, and then throw it back into the car. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this rest of the assembly of the motor here and whatnot. So hopefully it helps somebody out. And yeah, we'll be picking up tomorrow with a new video and hopefully get this thing in the car. So if you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe if you guys are new, and until next time, we'll see you later.